Jim Wilke and John Davis have brought us numerous presentations in the past on historic paint and painting schemes, particularly on locomotives and cars in the late 19th century. Recent presentations have included the Inyo, the Dayton, the Glenbrook, and 2 years ago, the unique Virginia and Truckee engine transfer car. Today, they are presenting a broader overview of the Virginia and Truckee early locomotive painting styles. So, Jim, you're up.
Thank you.
Don't hurt me.
All right, is this close enough?
Right up on it. If you put it
Right up on it.
If you're right up your chin, it's good.
How like this?
Yeah.
All right, let's see.
I'm working on it. No, hang on.
All right.
I decided you weren't going to like it with the edge foot or two on each side.
No, that gets in the way.
Yeah.
There we go.
Good work.
The old V&T cars and locomotive painted up for the new year look as spick and span as if just turned out of a bandbox. Notwithstanding the good colors and shining varnish, the superintendent of the paint shop assures us there will be no raise in passenger rates between here and Reno. So I think this is a great way to start, because repainting equipment, repainting locomotives, repainting cars is a very personal side to the railroad industry. In the past, we've talked a lot about how locomotives and cars were delivered as new, and they reflect the styles and the commercial market for locomotives and railroad equipment, the capital investments necessary to produce and operate a railroad. But once locomotives are brought onto a track, something very different happens, and a very different set of dynamics begin to take place. Let's see, get this thing on. And so we're going to talk about repainting locomotives on the Virginia and Truckee. And I'd like to just start with this shot of Tahoe. This is one of John's drawings. John was unable to make it this year, so he gives you his best and regrets. But we have a couple of new drawings. And this shows Tahoe as it was delivered new in the middle 1870s. It is a good example of what I like to call the splendid plant. This beautiful physical plant of operations that the Yarrington and Mills put up together and built this, spectacular infrastructure that represented a great deal of the pride and the huzzah of the middle 1870s, and also the gumption of the Comstock region. So this is a freight locomotive. It's finished. Its finish is pretty much a high freight finish. It has a brass wrapper. It has lots of brass trim. And then its paint scheme, it's striped and decorated in the passenger style, which was exceptional, unique to all Baldwin engines delivered in 1875 and 6 to Nevada and California, and also very distinctive to the Virginia Truckee. The Virginia Truckee had no specific livery, like many railroads in the 1870s. The comment by Yarrington to the Central Pacific shops, paint them as you feel best for them, I'm sure it'll be a credit to us all, is pretty typical of just about nearly every railroad at that time. So the locomotives would come like this, and then over time they'd be repainted in what would be a more personal style. Here is Tahoe in 1888. The engine has a completely new color scheme. The sandbox right there is still painted in its Baldwin style with its original style of scrollwork and gold leaf, but the tender has absolutely no striping whatsoever. This is a radical new style, which is only just now beginning to hit the railroad industry. And Tahoe, basically, in 1888, stands with 1 foot in the past and 1 foot in the future. Which begs the question, was there order to V&T paint schemes, or was there chaos? Well, there's never any chaos, but it does help to understand the order. Repainting locomotives is a necessary part of maintenance. It protects the locomotive. It has to be done on a very regular basis. It represents the personal pride and craftsmanship of car painters who've come up in the field, have a great deal of exercise, have a great deal of hands-on experience, and embodies the evolving ideals of what is considered fitting and right. The ornate 1870s Tahoe is considered as much fitting and right as the much plainer 1888 version. Each version represented something that they considered was appropriate and suitable. The 1870s Tahoe represented the pride of the commercial market. The 1880s Tahoe represented the keen sense of maintaining a good appearance under economic conditions. Locomotive painters were very professional men. Here's three of them. I'd like to just introduce you. This is Mr. Orr, who started off as a carriage painter, has been a sign painter, and now he's the Buffalo, Rochester, Pittsburgh master car painter. Mr. Quest got his start at the age of 16 in a carriage painting factory. He painted carriages when he was a teenager. He worked there for 4 years. He went on to another carriage factory and painted carriages for a year. He then went to the Pennsylvania Railroad, where he was a car painter for 16 years, and is now the master painter of the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie. There are many car painters on the Pennsylvania, but only so many master car painters. If you wanted to get up into the world and climb that ladder further, you had to spread out. And this took the knowledge of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which had hundreds of locomotives and thousands of cars, and had an absolute no-nonsense way about painting its cars, and that spread that knowledge throughout the entire railroad industry. And this is Mr. Cohen, who had worked with the Baltimore, Ohio, and was now with the Chesapeake in Ohio. Our sole object is to labor for the advancement of the art in which we take great pride, and to study the best interests of our employers. In other words, they wanted to do the best job possible, which reflected on them personally, but also do the best work for their employers, who were concerned about costs and time on everything. As railroads grew larger in size, particularly by the 1880s and 90s, the sense of scale changed, and the necessity of having simpler paint schemes on locomotives, simpler, more economical styles, and things, painting over the brass, for example, became very commonly mentioned in newspapers as, "Woe is us, the golden age is gone." There'd be frequent comments in the late 19th century trade press about how the brass is being painted over. The Virginia Truckee had two master car painters. This is Mr. Castle, who was master car painter from 1890 to 1936. Like the others, he came up in the field. He started off as a car painter on the Illinois Central. He then went to Sacramento and on the Central Pacific. For 1 year, he went to Utah, didn't like it, and came back. He was then on the Market Street Railway in the middle 70s, then the Southern Pacific. Then he went to the Virginia Truckee in the 70s and early 80s, although he's also listed as being in Sacramento in 1880, so this date is a little curious. Then he's with the Southern Pacific in Sacramento, and finally, in September 1890, he comes over to the Virginia Truckee to replace the previous master car painter, David Culp, who had died at the age of 42. David Culp's background is very similar. He was also in Chicago in 1870 as a car painter. He was then in Sacramento in the early 70s. He was then on the Market Street Railways, and he then went to the Virginia Truckee by 75, 76. You can easily reach the conclusion that these men were professional friendships that they had, that they knew each other, that they may have communicated with each other. Come out here to Sacramento, the weather is great, you won't have to endure another Chicago winter.
Hey Jim?
Yes?
He was painting cars for nearly 70 years?
Yeah.
He died in the saddle.
Oh.
He died in the saddle. And one of the great things is that the Virginia Truckee, I just learned this today, thanks to this group right here, is that when the Virginia Truckee no longer maintained a paint shop after his death, they just began to contract out. And I had wondered about this. In the 30s, the V&T's passenger cars go from rather beautiful yellow and green to a very harsh, acidic, nasty yellow and green. And this is, it's the kind of color scheme that you would expect to see on a gas station. And this kind, I wondered, like, does this happen when Joseph Castle dies? Because Joseph Castle's a 19th century man, and this shade of color is a very 20th century color scheme. And yes, it does. Apparently, I asked this past 2 days, and apparently this new style comes about as cars are now being contracted out to be painted. You can always tell by the paint what has happened. If a smokestack is a sure sign that a new master mechanic is on the roster, you can tell by changes in colors that something is going on and that there might be a change of habit. And that's what he did. Mr. Castle was a professional gentleman. He was part of many fraternal organizations. Mrs. Castle was part of fraternal organizations, sorority organizations. She was part of the Carson Red Cross during the First World War. And she continued her social life after Mr. Castle's death up into the 1940s. They were very prominent, social members of their community. It was an incredibly respectable trade to be a master car locomotive painter. So I want to give you a quick overview of Virginia trucking styles. They employ a repaint in kind approach, which is similar to their repair in kind approach, generally following the as-delivered style with minor variations, at least in the in the first decade. Virginia trucking locomotives were repainted about every 3 years in the 1870s. That's on average. There'll be many differences. And every 5 to 7 years in the 1890s. Locomotives were usually repainted during major overhauls and revarnished as necessary in between. You could do a light sanding of a paint, revarnish it, and it would come out looking brand new again. That's how you manage to extend the life of your paint scheme. Repairs were touched up as necessary on a spot basis. Virginia trucking, to my knowledge, never had any major catastrophic accidents, but it had a lot of minor ones. And there was a continual necessity of repair. One of the great examples of this is that the splasher sheet on Genoa, on one side of the locomotive, has 2 layers of an early layer of paint where a repair was made as opposed to the other side of the locomotive. So this is Virginia in the 1870s. She was repaired, repainted, and fixed up generally in June 1871, so she's getting close to being 2 years old. Virginia's being repainted in May 1872, and fully repainted after a 3-month overhaul in April 1874. So she's continually getting her nails buffed. She's always going in there, always getting a little bit cleaned up. We know from her trucks, that her tender trucks were delivered in a Brewster green with black stripes. The next paint scheme on these trucks was Brewster green with white and blue stripes, which may date to the 1871 paint scheme. It shows that the Virginia trucking would do what was there, but nudge it around a bit and maybe perk it up a bit. By the 1890s, a very different economy was in place. Economy had to be practiced. Here is Darwin on the Carson in Colorado, which was painted and varnished some point between 87 and 90, and this shows that work. No striping, no nothing except for the Baldwin style lettering, which is shaded. Touched up and varnished in March 92, touched up and varnished the tank only in June 94 after some repairs, and then in April 1897, 1 coat paint and 1 coat varnish. So that is 7 to maybe, at least 7 to maybe 10 years between the last time this locomotive was repainted. So they're getting good economy for the paint, which is something that they always wanted. And then in August 1900, 1 coat paint and 1 coat varnish. Things aren't much different on the Virginian trucking. Yenyo was scraped and painted in 1893. It was revarnished in 1895, revarnished again in 1896. In February 1899, painted and varnished 1 coat. December 1903, it was repainted with new lettering. June 1904, it was revarnished, and its last Virginia trucking paint scheme was in April 1921. Inyo's paint colors are fragmentary, but they give us a sense of a picture of how the locomotive evolved over time. This is Pantone 490. These colors may not exactly, but you'll get a sense of it. Found on the headlight bracket, it's a wine color roughly. It was also found on the tender frame plate, which is dated to 1881. So we can see that this wine color was used into at least 1881. That there are next 2 layers of brick red, a brick reddish color, Pantone 181, one with the tender frame brick red with a cream stripe, and then no stripe at all, and the white stripe shifts to a red stripe. The tender frame is painted brick red, but then we go into a red-brown, Pantone 476, whereas the lower works, the tender frames are going to black, and the tender tank is red-brown, then goes to black, and everything after that is black. I always find it helps to have a pictorial map of the styles. So I made one up for you. This is 1870s, 80s, 90s, and 1900s under David Colt and Joseph Castle. In the 1870s and 80s, there were separate styles for freight and passenger locomotives. From 1890s on, there were the same styles used on both engines, but different versions. So in the 1870s, the freighters, at least the early ones, tended to have stripes on the tender, which is a variation of the style that they were delivered in the early 70s. By the 80s, they were receiving a linear panel. This is the Glenbrook, showing this design. The passenger engines were very consistent in their style with beautiful panels. Then in the 90s, the panels go away, the stripes go away, and we have an era of no stripes. We would like to say black no stripes, which is a Baldwin phrase, a new style coming in very popularly, but we do not know just how early black became a common color on the Virginia Truckee. The Virginia, shown here, is about as early a unstriped Virginia Truckee locomotive as we have, but I cannot tell you whether it is black or if it's a dark brown or something else. All I can say is that at this point it's unstriped. We do have more evidence for the Inyo that it was black below and that beautiful brown color on the above. From 1900s on, however, we do know that the railroad has shifted to black and the lettering has changed from gold to aluminum. So let's now go into a little bit of an overview. In the 1870s, the colors are very rich. This is a very opulent style. This is the Washoe as it looked in the early 70s. It has Baldwin, heavy Baldwin style striping. It has lots of ornamentation in different colors. We see blue and cream and all sorts of stuff going on. This is Tahoe, also as new. And you can see it has a style 1 of the mid-70s, which is coming into use. The great red sunbursts on the driving wheels. Thorough, the frame, all the metal work is in the color. There are two styles against the freighter stripes and passenger panels. So let's start with the passenger panels and one of my favorite locomotives. The Reno, just an absolute beautiful machine. Here she is in the late 70s looking sharp and keen. She has, although it's not technically part of a paint scheme, it is part of something similar. This is a graphite smoke box door. This would be the most knobbiest thing any railroad could do in the 1890s. And here's a Virginia Truckee doing it in the 1870s. This is a snocky, I hope I can use this phrase, it's a snocky attitude, or knobby in the 19th century phrasing, to have this style on an engine in the early, in the late 1870s. It's very, very natty. And here you can see a panel on the back. Here is a close-up of the Reno's paneling work. This shows the design of the panel that Reno had when it was new. This is a New York Midland engine built in '71. Reno was built the following year. And if you look, it has a white stripe on the outside. It has a red stripe edged in white, and then an interior panel with three-dimensional scrollwork in multiple colors called polychrome. And here you can see the white stripe outside. You can see a thin light stripe, which would be bordering a red stripe right there. And then the gold stripe inside with a gap right there, a gap right here, and you can see where the polychrome lettering and scrollwork would have been. And this is just, it's just amazing. They completely followed the original Baldwin style all the way through. This is Peter Gretsch's drawing of the Virginia Truckee Reno's tender in the 1880s, late 1880s. And it's a similar design. There's an additional white stripe on the outside of the red stripe. And a very interesting thing, this lower stripe, the lower white stripe, jumps up to accommodate the toolbox. When a tender is painted in the factory, the toolbox is not attached yet. The painters are going all the way around it. So they have no concern for toolboxes. They simply place that nice white stripe all the way around the bottom of the engine. But as the locomotive is being repainted, that toolbox is there. The painters have to deal with it. And so they simply make that stripe jump up and over. And so it's always a little nice feature of that. So here she is in the late 80s, 1888 to 90. She has diamond trim on her dome tops, lots of Baldwin striping, very, very much the polished Baldwin engine. But by 1888, that's pretty exceptional. This is really an early to mid-70s paint style. So the Virginia Truckee is very traditional, which is a little bit distinctive. Here is Genoa around the same period of time, a very, very handsome engine. And you can see it also has many, many things going on. Let's take a look at Genoa. This is Genoa as built. We can see that part of this drawing is informed by the actual paint samples on the locomotive, like the green infills on the diamonds, on the dome tops, the green shading on the name on the cab, the varnished cab, things like that. And this is pretty much the same style of tender ornamentation that was on Reno. Don't have any surviving evidence for the tender. This is something that we don't know exactly what Genoa looked like. We've made this reconstruction based on the fact that the later photographs of Genoa show a polychrome scrollwork, which is consistent with this earlier style rather than a flat two-dimensional arabesque that would have occurred with a style 1. Here is Genoa circa 1890. I'll go back a little bit. The frame is now black. The trucks are blacks with striping. This panel right here has changed colors. The diamonds on the dome tops are now painted in multiple colors, which would vary from time to time. But the most interesting thing right here is that we now have a set of freighter stripes, which have been applied that are bracketing the tender. Here are some of the variations. John made up this little drawing. Here shows the paint layers on the sandbox top as delivered. The first repaint, a sort of brighter green, and then we start having real fun. The red shows up, and then they just change the pattern. The gold is going away, and now sort of a more economical straw color. Here's Baldwin as delivered. Then there's a sort of yellow and white, and then another yellow and white, but with a different style. They would change it just minutely. Every single paint layer shows a minor change. We were surprised to see the white layer on the outside of the red, but since that's the cab support bracket, it's right next to that, it might be simply countering. So here's, again, a quick sheer variation. You can see by comparing Genoa over a period of 15 or more years that the engine's very much the same, but there have been moderate, minor changes in the style. It's just been a slow evolution, and it is what I think is a very much repaint in kind, and I'm borrowing Stephen Drew's term of repair in kind for this. I think that's a very apt phrase. And here you can see again the slight variations that have come in. The red and black wheels, which were based on evidence from the surviving engine. And here is the tender, and that is that great freight striping. And here we can see a little bit of it. Here's the very same stripe that you see here. This is the 1876 display of Baldwin at the Centennial. This is the number 2 tank, which is part of the Style 3, which is intended for freighters. So Baldwin did not, to our knowledge, ever combine these stripes with a panel on the inside. It may have done it, but we have no evidence of it. It seems more possible, at least statistically, that this was something done by the Virginia Truckee's painters, perhaps indicating an attitude towards the use of the locomotive, or perhaps simply a variation so that they would tell it apart from Reno. I do not know the reason for it. All we can do is document it, and I think it's a really beautiful thing. Now, speaking of mysteries, here is the Ormsby as it was looked as the Mountaineer, as repainted in 1873, or possibly 75, prior to going up into the mountains, with this panel design. There is no other example of an engine in the photographic record, which is admittedly sparse, of this style of striping. And you can see it here. This is that photograph taken of the engine as it was dismantled. And you can see an interior stripe just coming down like so. There are a number of mysteries. In the early 70s, there's probably a sense that there would be a greater variation in paint schemes as they were trying things out to see what they may have liked. It may have been a little bit of a personality thing, or perhaps they decided that today is the day to try panels. We don't know. But we know that these things happen. Now, let's go on to the main line. And more common style is freighter stripes. So here's Lion, as it was repainted in 1873. And it has very, very broad stripes. There's no other stripes on this. And this late photograph is really wonderful because it gives us good sense of that. And here's similar broad stripes on the I.E. James, which may be an 1874 paint scheme, maybe a little bit later, but it has that broad, heavy feel. By the mid-70s, the stripes are getting a little bit lighter. Here's Story, as it was turned out in 76, and Washoe, which is repainted around the same time, and Virginia, which also has the stripes. You can see them right there. This was now a consistent style of striping for the freight locomotives of the Virginia Truckee. The origins of these stripes could come from many sources. Here's an 1870 Baldwin tender. It has thick, heavy stripes. Then it has a series of exterior stripes. This is what I call the Greek key pattern. This is the number 2 tank, which was used extensively between 1872 and 76. We know that the Virginia Truckee had at least one locomotive delivered with those stripes in 1876. Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company number 3. It may have had a few others. We do not know the actual appearance of the Moguls and the I.E. James as they appeared in between 1869 and 73. This is the Central Pacific style, which has the broad stripes, which is a development of 1873. And here's the Union Iron Works, which used striping from 1865 through at least the 1870s. This is a slightly later photograph of the San Francisco North Pacific engine. So now it's time for us to go to the 1880s, because what we've seen so far is variations of the Baldwin style at fairly intense level. I won't go into the passenger engines because you've already seen the passenger locomotives in the 80s, but we are going to go into the freighters, and some very interesting things are about to happen. The Virginia Truckee is now going to develop its own style, independent from Baldwin. By the time the year 1880s dawn, it's been quite a few years since they last bought their brand new locomotive. So here is the Glenbrook, or at least let's just say Carson Bow Lumber and Fluming number 4. As it appeared in the 1880s, you can see the style, which it never had when it was new. It has an outer stripe and then a panel, and the panel has a contrasting color. This seems to be a contrasting color as well, and possibly even the dome wrappers seem a little bit darker than everything else. We know that from the Glenbrook's evidence that the lower works are now painted a solid black striped in cream, that the upper works are sort of a brickish red color, and we believe that this is a contrasted red and brown. I'm sorry, brown and black. But we also see that there's heavy scroll work on the sandbox and steam dome, scroll work here, and this stripe. This is a very unique pattern. The freighter panel, is what we call them, shows up frequently. Here's the Glenbrook. Here is Nevada, California number 1, which is not anywhere on the Virginia Truckee system, but is so identical that it appears to have been painted by someone from the Virginia Truckee shops. And we know that Joseph Castle went up to Reno to paint a locomotive on the NCO right around the turn of the century. I believe it was the Amity. So it's possible that perhaps Mr. Culp might have painted this locomotive. And here is Dayton, as it appeared in 1890, with a similar style. John put this together to show you how Dayton's panel may have originated from Baldwin's. Here we have the standard Baldwin style. Here is a near literal Baldwin copy placed on the Story when it was being sold to Canadian Pacific Railway. You had the additional outer stripe. And here's the same style with the arabesques removed. And you can see there's a fairly consistent manner of approaching this new style so that it reaches its own new look. I kind of always wondered why this Story was repainted like this, and I don't know the answer. I'm going to venture one possibility may have been to impress the Canadians, or at least to impress Underdog. It didn't last like that. The Canadian Pacific branch under construction was an abattoir of locomotives.
Keeping in mind that behind Underdog was D.O. Mills.
So here's sandboxes in the 1880s. Sandbox scrollwork is pretty much gone on every other railroad by the 1880s. We are now looking at the coelacanth of sandboxes. So this is the Columbus in the late 80s or early 90s, and it has a beautiful three-dimensional scroll work, very similar to the Central Pacific style it had when it was new. This is Dayton on its side, and here you can see the scroll work as well. You can see the scrolls put together. When they're put side by side, it becomes very clear that Dayton had very much scroll work at this period of time. You can also see the stripes. Here is the Glenbrook again with its version, very heavy-handed. This is the California Nevada #1, which did not have scroll work at all when it was delivered. This was placed on it in the late 1880s. And then this is a detail of Tahoe, showing that original 1875 Baldwin scroll work, but as redone by the Virginia Truckee by the late 1880s. And let's look at the colors. I think this is very interesting. When John and I were working on the Glenbrook, we started putting together the colors that were indicated from the paint layers research. And it was concluding that the lower works were black and that the upper works were sort of a dark reddish brown color. And this is very shocking to us. I had no expectations. I always thought it would be red wheels. And at first we were a little surprised, but over time I think I can't speak for John, but I've actually grown to be fairly comfortable with it. And I think once you get to be comfortable with it, it makes a lot of sense. This is an engine that is a dark color locomotive. It's the 1880s. Everyone is getting much more serious about it. You know, it's much more, strictly business is the motto of the era. And so here we have an engine which is technically in colors, but also has a very easy to repaint, easy to work, lower running gear. A little bit of color work going above, but it doesn't stand out. It's very deep and hued, and it is a distinctive feature. So we're seeing the personalities and the preferences of the Virginia Truckees painters showing up. And here is Tahoe. Here you can see it in 1888, and here it is in 1888. Brown above, black below, with a plain unstriped tender. I suspect, I'd like to know this, but I think that the tender was striped at some point, and some repainting probably left it off. But one of the ways that people dipped their toe into modernity was to leave off the striping on one part of it, but continue striping everything else. You had sort of your hand on the handrail as you went into the modern world. And here's another close-up picture of Tahoe. Now we're going to enter the modern age. And we're going to do it starting in the late 1880s. One of the biggest trends of the modern age was the unstriped locomotive. And I chose this slide. This is Burlington and Missouri River 7. It was taken in the 1880s because this is where unstriped locomotives originated. The unstriped machine originated in the very late 1870s among the roads operating in the northern plains, the Granger Road, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, the Burlington and Missouri River. And it kind of spread out from there. These roads ran flat, they had a lot of eight-wheelers, and they had high drivers. They were able to go quite quickly. They had a very plain style, and it spread. In 1885, the Union Pacific adopted no striping, and it continued to spread. It just became the modern thing. And so here is Virginia, which is no striping, which is perhaps the earliest example of it. And here is the Darwin, again, in a 1887 to 1890 applied no striping paint. And here is Genoa, as she looked around 1902 with no striping. From Genoa, this is the first time that Genoa has been painted in an overall black. It looks quite modern for the Virginia Truckee, but even when the Virginia Truckee goes modern, it's nearly antique. This black and brass style was being done in 1875 everywhere else. This is Erie 425 as it looked in 1875. Brass cylinders, brass dome trimmings, and so forth. And here we have all the same on the Genoa. The Genoa is a modern engine, but it's a modern engine in the most traditional of ways. This is in your development company #1, the Tybo, a very personal favorite of mine. And again, as shopped in 1902, September 1902, I think. Brass here, brass down there, lots of brass trim, black, the gold leaf letters or imitation gold letters with yellow and then red shading, and a very modern looking style. But the machine age is about to meet the Gilded Age. And we're going to go into the new era of black and aluminum. And this whole aesthetic is completely different. Aluminum becomes a popular lettering color beginning in the 1890s, and is is originally used on freighters and eventually becomes used everywhere. And the Virginia Truckee adopts it in the middle 1900s. And I think this photograph, we saw this the other day, this was from the mid-teens, is that?
Probably 1911, 1912.
All right, 1911, 1912. And you can see that this style is very, very neat, it's very natty. It emphasizes the machinery. It emphasizes the silver machinery, and it helps to evoke a more modern sense of attitude towards the locomotive. And this is becoming very, very common among locomotive painters and railroad industry in general. But there's another feature about these locomotives which is very unique. The capstack has this either a white or a silvery or aluminum colored cap. This is a very distinct feature that is I've never seen this feature on any other railroad. It harkens back to a much older style from the 1880s where railroads would sometimes paint the underside of their capstacks red. But the Virginia Truckee never had capstacks at that point, so when they finally did get them, they painted them, but in a style which was consistent with the modern black and aluminum style. And I really like this photograph because you can see this whole black and aluminum at work on a brass age locomotive. And you can see there's also the silver up here. The Reno is not an engine attempting to look old through its brass. It's an old engine being kept up to date in the most modern way, but with the greatest amount of dignity. There is a beauty in this, and it's a very principled thing. But this is the other thing. No other railroad had maintained brass trim like this. This was now absolutely exceptional. And it was not being done in a hee-haw manner. It was being done in a very workmanlike and very appropriate style. The freight locomotives, or at least the working engines, were not so elaborate. They were now, by the 1920s, the Virginia Truckee was using the wind to paint locomotives. It was using, we just saw how you can pump water with wind. Well, now you can paint a locomotive with wind. It took 10 days now to paint a locomotive using a sprayer as opposed to several weeks. And the last photo I'll show you is the number 5. There's something a little bit interesting, perhaps because the engine came from abroad. It has a gold leaf lettering, but it also has an aluminum painted pilot right there. So as if the engine is a GS4, it has big dreams. So I'll just now line this up. The Virginia Truckee generally followed mainstream locomotive painting practice. In the 1870s and 80s, it employed separate styles for passenger and freight locomotives and used colors that reflected prevailing taste. It adopted unstriped engines by 1890 and black after that, within the window of mainstream practice. It was traditional, but never freakish, retaining polished brass trim up to the end, something no other road did. Its use of white or aluminum trim on capstack moldings was also unique. And now I'll just leave it at that. So I want to just tell you bad management. The large engine of the Nevada Central Railroad has been handsomely painted and rigged out in grand style. During the day, an amateur painter happened to drop in on the roundhouse and commenced painting red blotches over the engine, completely ruining his predecessor's work. The machinist has not been in his right mind since. So if that's it, we've got some colors and see if there's any questions.
Jim, what was varnish made from? I assume it changed over the years, but in the early 1970s. Was it linseed?
Oh, I don't even know. I just know what the colors were. I don't know.
I figured you'd be a chemist on this.
No, they always want you, you're like those people who restore things. You're a upholsterer and a painter and a carpenter and everything else. No, I just like to figure out the strategy of the color.
So no longer the paint away there, now it's the seal of paint.
Yeah, any colors, any questions? We all look stunned and hungry, that's all.